Now your host for the Middle East Radio Forum, attorney William J. Wolf.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're listening from. It is June 23, 2019. Okay. Devin, Sper, good afternoon. How are you?
Good afternoon, Bill. I'm great.
You haven't been on the show since February. Welcome back. Very briefly, introduction. You're the author of a very interesting book called The Future of Israel. It's got one of the nicest dust covers that I've ever seen. It's beautiful. And you also have a blog on the Times of Israel, and people can look at your writings at www.devinsper.com. Let me repeat the spelling. devinsper.com. Thanks for being here today. Devin, we're going to talk about political chaos in the Israeli politics following the recent elections. A lot of us don't understand it that well. We have talked about it a little bit on the show already, but I'm sure you'll bring some sanity to the discussion here. Immediately following the recent Israeli elections, the Israeli parliament scheduled a new election, and President Trump reacted by saying, quote, "Israel is all messed up with their election. I mean, that came out of the blue 3 days ago, so that's all messed up. They ought to get their act together. Bibi got elected. Now, all of a sudden, they're going to have to go through the process again until September. That's ridiculous." Is the president right in what he said? Is the Israeli political system messed up?
The short answer is yes, I'm afraid he is. I don't want to get too deep into the weeds about the Israeli political system, but it's necessary to explain it a little bit to the listeners so they will understand why it is as chaotic as it is. And that way, when you hear news about Israel and all these different parties and coalitions, I hope that after today that will make more sense to you and you'll understand what's going on. So very briefly on the system itself, Israel has a parliamentary system like England, France, and most of the European countries. And that means that you don't usually end up with two parties. People vote for a party rather than a representative in a district. And the party elects the slate that goes into the parliament, in Israel's case, the Knesset. So you have no direct contact with your representative, and he has no accountability to a particular district. He's accountable only to the party. So that's a bad thing in the first place. And then secondly, as I said, this means that there are not two parties, but there are, in Israel's case, a dozen parties in the parliament. And so no one of them can form a government as we do here immediately after the election. We had an election, and it was going to be either the Republicans or the Democrats, one or the other. It's always a coalition. And so there's a few months of horse trading where they give out seats in the cabinet. And that also means that cabinet seats are not assigned based on the most qualified person, as they are here. Here, the president, at his discretion, picks someone qualified to be defense minister, someone qualified to be treasury minister, and he's not beholden to any other party or even his own. In Israel, the seats are given out in the cabinet according to how many people are in the coalition, and they have nothing to do with the qualifications of that person to do that job. So, for example, the previous defense minister was Lieberman, who, whether you like him or not, was a sergeant in the army and not really qualified to be defense minister of Israel in any way. They've had foreign ministers who hardly speak English. They've had treasury ministers who know nothing about economics. But the bigger problem is this creates instability. So any one of these little parties that form the coalition can threaten to leave and hold the government hostage over a bill or a particular issue. And they do, and they leave, and as just happened, they bring down the government. And in this case, the government, there was a new election because one party with 5 seats brought down the government. They had a new election, and they weren't able to form a coalition because that same party refused to enter. And they immediately called a new election. So you had an election, there was never a government formed, and you have a new election. So another 3 months of political chaos.
Okay, just so we're clear, I think you've touched on it, but I just want to make sure everybody understands what you mean when you say they have to form a coalition. Can you explain that a little bit more detail?
Okay, good question. There are 120 seats in the Israeli Knesset, so you need 61-seat majority to form a coalition. Again, there is no direct vote for the prime minister as there is here for the president. You vote for a party, and parties have to get together with 61 seats to nominate themselves a leader. Since no one could put together a coalition of 61 seats, they called a new election. Now, I want to say a few positive things, having said all that about the Israeli system, which I think is not as good as our system in many ways, objectively speaking. Despite that, Israeli politics is serious because they're facing existential issues. And so the public debate is very serious on a high level, and the public involvement is very high. In the last election that we just had, close to 70% of the people voted, which is a much higher percentage than we get here in the United States. So the public is serious, the debate is serious, but the system is not good.
Okay, Devin, some of the Democratic presidential candidates have also made disparaging comments on Israel's government. For example, Bernie Sanders recently called the Israeli government racist. Is there any truth in this, and why would any of the Democratic presidential candidates even comment about Israel's government?
Well, let me answer the second question first. They're commenting about, it's a good question. They're commenting about Israel's government because the Democratic base, or the active Democratic base, is on the far left. That is, those people who really have the energy in the party, who will come out to vote, is today the far left. And they've bought hook, line, and sinker into the Palestinian propaganda, which demonizes Israel. And so these ideas have crept into the base. And even people like, for example, Swalwell and Harris and other people who have never been anti-Israel are making here and there anti-Israel statements because they're politicians and they're playing to their base, and their base, unfortunately, has become anti-Israel. So that's the answer to the second question. As to the first question, Bernie Sanders calling Israel racist, Bernie Sanders hasn't offered any support for that description. He hasn't cited any Israeli policies or laws or statements of the Netanyahu government that are racist. And I believe that Bernie Sanders is one of those many people today who will call racist anybody who has a different opinion than his on any issue. And since he can't bring and hasn't brought any support, I don't think it's something we can take seriously.
Devin, do you think Bernie Sanders is knowledgeable about Israel at all? I mean, is there any other country in the world that has flown black Africans to their country to live in freedom and to be fully participating citizens like Israel has? I forget how many thousands of Ethiopians have been flown by Israel from Ethiopia to Israel to be citizens of the state. Has any other country ever done that?
No, and he is not knowledgeable, as most of the candidates are not, as most Americans are not that familiar with the intricacies of the Middle East, which is very different than our politics and our societies. And Bernie Sanders basically knows the Palestinian propaganda line, and that's the extent of his knowledge.
So he's basically speaking when he has no information to really distribute to anybody.
Well, if you're going to call someone racist, anybody, then I think you should back that up. That's a pretty harsh charge. And I don't think people should throw around labels like that without explaining what they mean. And since Sanders has refused to do that and has failed to do that, I dismiss what he says because there's nothing to it. The Israeli government is not racist, and there's nothing to that at all.
Has anybody called Sanders on that? I mean, said to him, listen, you have to back that up because that's the opposite of the truth. Israel is anything but racist. And has anybody done that?
No, and that's why I'm glad you brought it up, because this is the first opportunity I've had to mention it. But no, people have mentioned some of the very anti-Semitic things that Representative Omar or Tlaib have said, but no one has called Bernie Sanders or some of the other candidates on some of their anti-Israel statements. And this is just one example of these things they say. Their base all applauds, but this is sheer ignorance on their part and the part of their base who don't know the issues and don't know what they're talking about.
So basically, I get from your saying that you believe that a lot of the elements now of the Democratic Party have become anti-Semitic. Certainly anti-Israel.
They're certainly anti-Israel, and in many cases they cross the line to anti-Semitic. Now, I would say Bernie Sanders is not anti-Semitic in that sense, but some of the others are. And there's a fine line between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, and very often it crosses the line, and I can give you examples of that. But Bernie Sanders is just an old-fashioned communist. He calls himself a socialist, but he's an old East Coast communist, and he hasn't changed his ideas in 65 years, despite the collapse of the Soviet Union and the utter failure of communism.
Okay, Devin, thank you. We are coming up on the first break of today's show. Welcome back to today's edition of Middle East Radio Forum. My name is William Wolf. My guest is Devin Sper. Devin Sper, let's continue talking about the Israeli political system and the Democratic Party here in the United States. What about Pete Buttigieg's recent statement that the Netanyahu government is turning away from peace? He's obviously one of the candidates for the nomination for the presidency. What do you think about that?
Well, again, he hasn't offered any evidence of that, as Bernie Sanders offered no evidence of labeling the government racist. And if he believes that, he should say so and explain what he means by that. I could take a guess as to what he means by that, but I really can't be sure. Also, I think it's chutzpah for the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, to be lecturing the longest-standing prime minister of Israel about the Middle East. I don't think Pete Buttigieg knows anything other than some Palestinian propaganda he's heard, and I don't think he really knows what he's talking about here either. I think he's buying in. If I had to take a guess, I'd say he's buying into the Palestinian propaganda line that it's Israel that's in the way of peace. And of course, first of all, I'd say, what peace? There hasn't been peace in the Middle East in 1,300 years. The Sunnis are killing the Shiites. Iraq had a war with Iran. They're slaughtering each other in Syria wholesale. Yemen, Libya, all in a state of anarchy. So what this has to do with Israel and what Israel could possibly do that would bring peace to the Middle East, I don't know. All Israel can do is defend herself in a very chaotic and rough area. What I think he means is Israel is not caving in to Palestinian pressure to give away her land. But there is no evidence that this has worked in the past. In fact, it has failed. And people like Buttigieg just keep repeating the same line that Israel needs to do something or give something. And I assure you that if Pete Buttigieg was Prime Minister of Israel, there's nothing he could do that would bring peace to the Middle East as a whole, nor is there anything he could do that would make the Palestinian enemy peaceful, because their goal is not peace, and it's not a state. Their goal is the destruction of Israel. They've maintained a maximalist position for all these years. They're not open to compromise. They're not interested in where Israel's border goes. They're interested in having Israel wiped out. And under those circumstances, there's really nothing Israel can do except survive and be strong and not cave to that. And that's what the policy of the Netanyahu government is. And every previous government in Israel, including governments on the far left. They have all come around to the same position, which there is no one to talk to on the Palestinian side, and all you can do is defend yourself from their vicious and radical attacks.
Okay, well, let me ask you this. Not just about Pete Buttigieg, but what about the other Democratic candidates? Do they feel they're going to enhance their chance to becoming the nominee of the Democratic Party for the presidential election by bashing Israel? Do they feel that it's going to be helpful to their cause?
Yes, and they feel that because the radical left wing of the Democratic Party has been permeated with Palestinian propaganda and buys into it. On universities, you see that. You see that in the reaction of crowds to the statements like those that you mentioned. And remember, that doesn't mean it's the majority of Democrats, but it's the radical left that has the energy, that are the people who would turn out. You know, I mentioned the lower turnout you have in American elections compared to Israeli elections. And that's even lower in a primary. That's the general election. But in a primary, you get very few people turning out. So you don't need a majority of the Democrats to win the Democratic nomination. You need a majority of those who turn out. And that's a small number. And so they're appealing to that number, which is energized, which hates Trump, and which they think will turn out, primarily motivated by hatred of Trump. And Trump is also a friend of Israel, so that too makes them opposed to Israel.
So basically what you're saying is the radical element within the Democratic Party is going to hold sway because they're more likely to come out in big numbers to vote what they want to achieve.
In the primary. Now, in the general election, all these people are going to have to pivot because they are all taking radical positions on the Green New Deal, on all these silly things that they themselves don't believe in. Biden is changing his previous positions on a daily basis to appeal to this radical fringe. But when it comes to the broad electorate in a general election, that won't fly. So you'll see them backtrack.
Yeah, but the candidate will have been chosen by the radicals, so there's only a choice to vote for the Democrat or the Republican.
That's right.
So they're basically choosing the radical person in the primary, and so if you're a Democrat, you're going to have to vote for the radical person if you want to stay with the Democratic Party.
Or not. And that's what will increase Trump's chances if they do go in that direction.
Boy, it's certainly a game changer what's going on now, I think. I can't imagine any other election that's ever been like this before. We're going to be coming up on the next break in a couple of minutes, but I'm going to ask you the next question. Perhaps we'll go over to the other side of the break before we get your answer. But leaving aside the minutia of Israeli political system, can you give us an overview of the broad trends driving Israeli politics today? That's pretty broad question, but I'm going to let you handle it any way you want. I'll give you a couple of minutes, then I have to go to break.
All right. So since we only have a couple of minutes before the break, what I'll do is I'll state the two broad trends that I see in Israeli politics, and after the break, we can go into further detail. And this is really what I wanted to get to today. Having described the chaos in the system, there are two overarching broad trends that our listeners should know about in order to understand what they see going on in Israel. One is the country has moved consistently to the right. And the second is that there is this new patriotism in Israel, particularly among young people, that is different from the Zionism of the past. It's different from the defensiveness of previous generations who emigrated to Israel from somewhere else. These are young people who were born in Israel, and their view of the world is quite different. And what I'll do is, after the break, I'll go into detail, and this will enlighten you so that when going forward you hear news about Israel, you'll be able to see the broad trends, even if all the minutia and the detail seems confusing.
Okay, now, Devin, it might be obvious to you, and it's obvious to me, but I want you to explain a little bit when we come back from the break what you mean by move to the right.
Yes.
What does that mean, and what does move to the left mean?
I'll explain that in detail.
Okay, we are coming up on the next break. You're listening to Middle East Radio Forum here on 960 The Patriot. My name is William Wolf.
Now back to your host, Attorney William J. Wolf.
Welcome back to today's edition of Middle East Radio Forum. My name is William Wolf. My guest is Devin Sper. Okay, Devin Sper, we started to talk about the minutia of Israeli political system and broad trends and driving their politics. You talked about moving to the right. Again, I asked you to explain what moving to the right or to the left means, and also about the new patriotism you've found in Israel. Go ahead, please.
Well, that's a very good question. People use the term right and left, and we should define it. So in very broad terms, generally speaking, the right is for individual freedom and the left more for state control in all things, in economics, in foreign policy, in every way. So the right usually favors individual freedom in, for example, free markets as opposed to government intervention in the markets. And it favors national sovereignty as opposed to, for example, globalism, which the left favors.
And you're not just talking about Israeli politics.
In general.
You're talking about any country, the left and the right.
Yes. The terms left and right come from the French Parliament following the Revolution, where the right sat on the right, what we're calling today the right, and the left, the socialist side, sat on the left side of the Parliament, and that's where those terms come from. And in Israel, it's the same thing. The right favors individual freedom, the sanctity of national sovereignty, free markets. Now, I'd like to explain also why Israel has moved to the right. Because this is opposite to the trend in Europe, for example, where things have moved to the left. And there are two main reasons for that. The one is that socialism failed in Israel. It was originally a socialist country, and socialism failed in Israel as it has in Europe, in the East Bloc, in Venezuela, in Cuba, in China, and every other country in which it's been tried. So the economic policies failed. And some years ago, when Netanyahu became prime minister for the first time, he went over to a free market economy. And Israel's economy went from $16 billion GDP to what it is today, which is $316 billion GDP. And nobody in Israel thinks we should go back to socialism. And that's on the economic thing. And then even more important than that is that the Labour Party, which was on the left, hitched its wagon to the idea of land for peace and the Oslo peace process. And as this proved a failure and a false assumption and a house of cards and collapsed, what was most damaging to them is they refused to acknowledge this. They doubled down. They tried to give away more land when we were attacked from the land we had just given back. And this sort of putting their head in the sand like an ostrich alienated them more and more from Israeli people, particularly young people who grew up under bombardment from Palestinian rockets and Palestinian terror and saw no reason why we ought to give them anything at all. And so the youth in particular has moved away from the Labour Party.
Okay, we're coming up on the next break, but let me ask another question here. And again, you may have to give the answer after the break here. What evidence do you see that Israel has moved to the right? And again, that means toward more personal responsibility, less government control. Go ahead, please.
Well, if we take the example of the Labour Party that I mentioned, which was the dominant force in Israeli politics and a left-wing party that advocated socialism, they had 56 seats in the first Knesset in Israel, and they have steadily declined to the point where in this last election they won 6 seats. In other words, they declined by 90%. So that's one measure of how the left has declined. Their brand is so burned that they changed their name in the previous election to the Zionist Union. And when that didn't work for them, they changed it back to the Labour Party. They've changed leaders almost every year. And what they do is whenever their seats go down in election and they fail, they blame the leader. But the reality is the problem isn't the leader. The problem is their ideology, their failed socialist and land for peace ideology. They don't want to recognize that, and so they continue to lose adherents.
Okay, let me stop you there, Devin, because we are coming up on the third break. Please stay with us. We're right back with Devin Sper. Welcome back to the final segment of today's Middle East Radio Forum. My guest is Devin Sper. Steve from Northwest Phoenix is a great friend of Middle East Radio Forum. I know you're holding for us. We'll take your question after Devin finishes with the last question that I asked him. Devin, please finish about the evidence you see that Israel has moved to the right, and you talked about the decline of the Labour Party. Please continue your answer.
Well, another sign of that would be that the main opposition today is a party called Blue and White, as Labour, as we discussed, has sunk to irrelevance. And Blue and White is made of 3 former chiefs of staff who formed the party, and they attack Netanyahu and the Likud from the right often. They say that he is not aggressive enough on Gaza, that he has not closed out the show and lets the problem fester. And so if Netanyahu is being attacked politically, he's being attacked from the right, not the left, which is irrelevant. In fact, calling someone a leftist in Israeli politics today is something that all the parties do. So Blue and White calls Netanyahu a leftist, and he calls them a leftist, which tells you how bad the left's brand is in Israel. Everyone flees from that label. It's like calling someone a racist in the United States. And that's because they, as I said, hitched their wagon to Land for Peace. It turned into a disaster which thousands of Israelis died for no reason, and the Israeli people have had it with the left, with their economics, and with their foreign policy.
Okay, Devin, let's get the questions in. We have a couple here. First is a great friend of the show. He's been a longtime listener, Steve from Northwest Phoenix. Steve, thank you very much for being a great listener of this program. Go ahead, please. What's your question?
Yeah, thank you so much. I just wanted to say that CUFI has blew through 6 million on the first day of the Six-Day War on the 5th of June, and we'll hit 7 million before the end of the year. But anyway, we're conservative, and so supporting America has gone conservative. My question is, though, this. the Orthodox two parties were kingmakers in this lax election that failed. And the IDF has done everything they possibly can to accommodate these two conservative parties, but they will not compromise with Lieberman. And now we're in another election. What's the answer?
Okay, Steve, hold on, because Devin may want to ask you something further. So stay on the line. Devin, go ahead, please.
Yes, your analysis is correct. And in fact, as you know, perhaps the government fell immediately after election on that very issue because Lieberman would not accept the idea that the religious will not be drafted into the army, and the religious parties are against that. And I'll tell you what I think the answer is, for whatever it's worth. Mathematically, I don't see any other possibility but that the Likud and Blue and White form a coalition. Now, they label each other leftist, but the reality is there's no ideological difference between them, no discernible ideological difference. Blue and White is also for free markets. Blue and White is for at least as hard a line on the Palestinian issue as is Netanyahu, and at least is open to peace were it to present itself as is anyone else in Israel. So I think that together they would have two parties only in a coalition. He wouldn't have to triple the size of the government as he was about to do because of the last crazy coalition negotiations. He would have a stable majority of well over 70 seats, and that is the only workable solution. It doesn't matter whether anyone likes that or not. I simply don't see another mathematical possibility.
Okay, thank you, Devin. Steve, anything follow up very briefly?
As a question, no. I just want to see a success. I'd like to see the prime minister back in there. He's done a good job, and no one can represent Israel like Netanyahu at this time in history. That's just my opinion. He's
right.
eloquent.
Steve, thanks very much, and I love Ko-Fi too. That's Christians United for Israel. Go ahead, Devin.
Yes, first of all, thank you for Kufi and what they do. We appreciate it, and Israel appreciates it. About what you said, you are in the majority in Israeli opinion as well, feels that Netanyahu should be prime minister. So when I say a coalition with Blue and White, it's clear that the Likud would be the senior partner, that Netanyahu would be the prime minister, and that the defense minister would be the head of Blue and White, Benny Gantz, who is former chief of staff and eminently qualified to be defense minister. That's the obvious government. Now, anything can happen in Israeli politics, crazy as it is, but I think that would be a reasonable outcome and a likely outcome.
Why didn't it happen after the first election?
I can only guess, but Netanyahu is trying to form a narrow right-wing coalition without Blue and White because the Labor Party, his main opposition for all these years, has practically disappeared. This new Blue and White appeared, and the history of middle parties, center parties in Israel is that they disappear quickly. They come and they go. And I think he was hoping that if he kept them in the political wilderness, they wouldn't even be around in the next cycle.
Well, when it didn't work, why didn't he turn to Blue and White and do it without another election?
That's a good question. I wasn't privy to the negotiations. I think he also vilified them in the elections, calling them leftists and this and that and the other thing, and there was too much bad blood. And I think if he's smart, he will go easier and they will end up together. Okay,
thank you very much again for that question, Steve. Let's go quickly to Ken calling from Scottsdale. Ken, you're on the air, please.
Okay, simple question, never asked, and I'm going to ask it. Why can't some people with shotguns stand at the border and take down all the kites and balloons that float up? I got guys that are in the Ben Avery Lodge shooting range and the Scottsdale Gun Club that could take down every kite and every balloon that comes up.
Ken, we're going to take up...
And listen.
All right, Ken, we're going to take up a collection and send you to Israel to do that. But go ahead, Devin.
I think that's a really good question, and it's something I've been wondering about. There are these fire balloons that the Palestinians in Gaza send over, and they really cause a lot of damage. It sounds like nothing, but this balloon lands on fields, burns down acres and acres of crops, burns down houses, causes all kinds of damage, and it's true. I can't imagine why, there are snipers lined up all along the border now because of the riots. And I can't imagine why a sniper couldn't take down a balloon, because I could take down a balloon. floating at the speed it's floating. So that seems to me an obvious answer, and I, for the life of me, can't figure out why they don't do that. Maybe they send them over at night and you don't see them that well. I'm just speculating, but it's a really good question. I don't know the answer to that.
Ken, keep up your good work at Scottsdale Gun Club. Thank you for the call. Okay, Devin, let's try to get into the second broad trend you mentioned. I think we're talking about
the new Israeli patriotism. Right. Yes. And that's really the point I wanted to get to, and everything else we've discussed is to lead up to this, because what I want to really explain to our listeners is not the minutia of how the system works, but what's going on in broad trends. And we talked about the country moving to the right. Even more important is what I'll call the new Israeli patriotism. I've never heard it labeled that way. It's just what I'm calling it. You know, Israelis have always been proud of their survival against tremendous odds. But what's changed now is that they are not just proud of their survival, they're proud of their success. And they should be, because they built an amazing country. They built a country with a $316 billion gross domestic product. This is a country with 9 million people and has a gross domestic product of $316 billion. That's higher per capita income than Japan. And they have no natural resources. They have the highest defense budget in the world. They are surrounded by enemies and constantly threatened. And yet they've built this booming economy, which did not even see a recession in 2008 when the whole world went into recession. They have to build walls on their border in Israel today, like we do, to keep people out. I'm talking about Muslims from neighboring countries who are crossing minefields and ISIS-controlled territory in Syria, in Sinai, in Jordan, in order to get into Israel. And in Israel, they have no legal status. There's no safety net for them. And they're still coming in by thousands, because still, with all that, life in Israel is better for them than in the tyrannical, poverty-stricken, chaotic countries from which they're coming.
Let me make a comment. I was in Israel last year, and I was in South Tel Aviv, and it looks like Africa in there. It's just unbelievable. But the Israeli government is building schools and everything to support these illegal African Muslims. Why is that?
I'll tell you something very touching about that. I was watching Israeli TV, and they've tried in some cases to deport some of these people because they have no legal standing. And they don't want the whole of Asia and Africa in Israel. It's a small, crowded country. But these people have over time grown to really love Israel. They speak Hebrew. They walk around waving little Israeli flags. They wear yarmulkes. These are Muslims. I'm talking Muslim from Africa. And they say, the young ones who they interview, the kids, they say, listen, this is where we already grew up. I don't know anything about Sudan. I don't know anything about Ethiopia. This is my home. I want to be here. I want to serve in the army. And I find that very, very moving and touching. But what I'm bringing it as I don't want to get too deep into the question of immigration, but what I want to say is a country that has to build walls on its border to keep people out is a successful country. The Soviet Union had to put up walls and barbed wire to keep people in, because that system didn't work. And that tells you how prosperous and how good life has become in Israel. It's basically today like a northern European country, very modern, very efficient, very clean. It's not the Israel of even 10 years ago. Big infrastructure, highways, high-speed trains, beautiful beaches. And so the Israelis are proud not just of their survival today, but they're proud of this wonderful, beautiful country that they've built. They have the fastest growing population in the developed world. That's natural increase. In most of the developed world, birth rates go down. In Israel, they've been going up, and in fact have surpassed the Muslim birth rate in Israel. The Israelis have built a high-tech military, which many people know about, but they may not be aware to the extent of the advancement. Israel produces all kinds of missiles and drones that even the United States does not produce. For example, they have missile boats that are drone missile boats. They have, aside from airplanes, they have all kinds of armored vehicles that are drone armed vehicles. They are the top 1, 2, or third in the world in cybersecurity for obvious reasons. They've built smart missile technology, which is more advanced than even our smart missile technology. The United States just agreed to purchase some Israeli Iron Dome batteries, which was developed in Israel with American financial help. So what I want to say in summary is that young Israelis have been voting more to the right than older people, the opposite of what you have in this country. If the Labor Party got 6 seats in the last election, that was older people on the kibbutz who are still nostalgic for those days. Younger people are by and large patriotic, to the right, volunteering for, despite their prosperity, volunteering for the harder commando units in numbers which they're not even places for them. They don't have the defensive mentality of Jews from the diaspora who emigrated there and are worried of what other people think of them. They see their country the way a patriotic American sees his country, the way a patriotic Russian sees his country. It's his country. He was born there. His family lives there, and he's going to defend it, and he's not going to give his land away to anybody, and he's not even going to entertain that idea. They're not worried about all they've known about the Palestinian enemy since their birth are rockets, missiles, and terror. The peace process collapsed after he was born 21 years ago, and he's not interested in hearing about all that false nonsense and false peace process. He's going to defend his country the way an American who's patriotic would defend our country, and I think this is a healthy development, and I'm very proud of the younger generation in Israel. They've got their heads screwed on straight, and I think it bodes very well for the future of Israel and Israeli politics.
Devin, I thank you very much for your presentation today. This was terrific information. Please spread the word about this show. Get other people to catch it on the podcast. You can listen to old shows anytime you like on my website, MiddleEastRadioForum.org. Again, MiddleEastRadioForum.org. Spread the word about Middle East Radio Forum, but especially today's show was very, very interesting.